Hey there. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Della Rucker. I'm the principal of the Wise Economy Workshop and author of the recent book, The Local Economy Revolution Has Arrived, What's Changed and How You Can Help. Thank you again for joining me. I'm in a little bit of a different location from usual today. I am on dog care duty for the dogs that we are fostering, and they're nicely napping back behind me. So that old saw about sleeping dogs lie. We're gonna like hope we can live by that one. So I'm in the downstairs, actually in my kitchen, and it's a lot nicer to be in the kitchen when I don't have food to make in a giant hurry because I got to get it done so we can get to something else. That seems to be my primary experience with cooking and the kitchen. And so if you're ever thinking you're going to find recipes on this channel, probably not. At least none that you'd actually want to try. I can feed people. I didn't say it was pretty. So, but it is a glorious day here in Cincinnati. We've got beautiful sunny skies finally after kind of a swamp situation yesterday. I've always joked that we kind of live in the swamp here in Southern Ohio because we get so much more rain and so much more humidity than a lot of parts of the country that you may be more familiar with. So today we're going to talk a little bit about another one of the first principles of the local economy revolution has arrived. And as I've said before, these first principles are really about kind of the core understanding, the core underpinning of why this book proposes that we need to do things differently, that we need to kind of fundamentally rethink our approach to how we take care of and work to revitalize the communities and places that we care about, whether that's a neighborhood or a city or a region, whether you do that as your day job or as your passion or as both. If you're doing it for your job, hopefully it's a passion as well. Certainly most people I've met in my life who've chosen to do that work have a passion for it as well, which makes them just incredible to work with. So the first principles in this book are really sort of the framework for thinking about how the world has so fundamentally changed and is in the process of fundamentally changing from the world in which a lot of our programs and maybe more importantly our organizational assumptions were developed, thinking the 1960s, 50s, even back into the 30s and the 20s in the United States. And that timeline will be a little bit different in other countries, but so much of what we do when we are trying to improve our communities has its roots in the thinking of that era. And in some cases, it made sense in the context of that time period. And in some ways, some of the things that we have done, urban renewal is a good example for you planning geeks. It was only a good idea because we had a limited view of kind of what the world was like and what would happen as a result of what we did. So the first principles are really about what are the characteristics of the world that we have today and more importantly are moving into. How is that different from what we have in most cases come up with? And how do we need to fundamentally reset not just the technical things that we do, but sort of the assumptions that we bring into the work to reflect on and capitalize on the opportunities that this new era presents, while also fixing or at least not repeating mistakes that our predecessors and sometimes we made in the past. So I'm going to start by reading a section out of here. This is one of the first principles, and it is called Human Communities Are Human Ecosystems. Now, as a backup, when I first wrote this when I first wrote in an earlier version of this in the early 2010s, that was a much more radical idea on the surface than we might think of today. We talk a lot more about ecosystems, but I'd encourage you to listen a little bit, and then we're going to unpack it a little bit, because even though we're a little more comfortable with the concept of an ecosystem now than we were 10 years ago or 8 years ago, we're still not always putting that awareness into action. So here we go. Human communities are human ecosystems. Everything we do, whether a business or a land use plan or a nonprofit program or an economic development incentive, is not going to stay in the silo or in the place where we put it. We want to picture the world around us as working like a machine, particularly in our professional spaces. We want to think about an input leading to a predictable output, because that gives us some sense of optimism, that we can predict what our work will cause. But in reality, that very seldom happens. Instead, human ecosystems, like cities or neighborhoods, are basically like forests and oceans and prairies. They are systems of interconnected systems, such as growth and decomposition, weather and weathering, hunter and prey. What happens to one system impacts all the others. And when we mess up one of them, it has an impact on everything else. And we've become much more aware of this as the impacts of climate change have been playing out. The impacts are often an unintended consequence of what we did. Now, we know all of that. We have decades of science on this exact trend. But because we don't do a good job of transferring those learnings to human ecosystems, we make new unintended consequences all the time. And we don't just fail to anticipate the unintended consequences of our programs and our projects and our initiatives, but we purposely often don't go looking for them. We could see them if we looked for them, because we've got lots and lots and lots and lots of examples to learn from. But we don't. By not critically examining how our systems impact each other, we permit wide and deep and often unintended repercussions. Repercussions that affect real people who, again, as we said in a previous first principle, are the ones that we're supposed to be doing this for. So that's some heavy stuff. Let's talk about that for a moment. And in the book, I use a lot of examples from gardening and farming and ecosystem management. There's like 3 chapters that are based around metaphors about flowers. So, I figured that's something that's pretty accessible to everyone, and especially this time of year when we're just on the verge of, starting to have those things again. Certainly that feels good. But let's talk about one of the things that very often happens, and this is different from what's in the book. So this is not a repeat of what you'll read about in the book. But as we said in that first principle, we have a tendency, and we have learned and often been taught, that if we do this thing, then this other thing will happen as a result. It's kind of an ipso facto. If we put in a certain program, we will reduce poverty. We will make housing more affordable. We will do something. And then it becomes a question of the political willpower to do that program. But as a fundamental step back, we need to realize that when we do a program, we do a project, we do something in the environment, it may very well cause the changes that we intended, but it will also potentially cause a cascade of other impacts. So I'll use a simple plant example, and then I'll go to some urban planning history examples. So again, this is not an urban planning history lesson, although that might be really interesting to do. And I don't think you necessarily have to be a planning geek to find those interesting. But so let's take the first example. So I'm actually looking at my backyard right now, and I'm fortunate to have a house with a small backyard that has lots of stuff growing in it. One of the things that is growing back there is periwinkle. So if you're familiar with landscape plants at all, periwinkle is in this environment, in our climate, it's kind of evergreen. It's a low plant that puts out little blue flowers in the spring, very pretty, but it's usually used mostly as a ground cover. So you plant it and you expect it to spread, which is awesome. If you've got a space that you need to cover, that where maybe, you don't want to grow grass or grass doesn't seem like a good idea. But if you plant periwinkle and it basically likes the location that you're putting it in, it can very easily grow into things that weren't where you intended it to grow. And sometimes even if you put up barriers to supposedly prevent it from going there. So I have a dry creek bed that we put in because, again, we live in, swampland, and, we would get very extensive kind of puddling and just basically muck back there. So we put in a dry creek bed that's basically a big drain, big passive drainage system. The periwinkle is all grown through that now over the last 8 years or so. And while that's nice, it does impede the water flow. So the intent of the periwinkle, and again, this is a really tiny example, but the intent of the periwinkle was not to recreate the water damming problems that we had before. The intent of the periwinkle was to cover the ground under the trees where, grass didn't particularly grow very well. So that's a very small unintended consequence. If we look at the history of planning and economic development and community development in a lot of our cities, and I'm particularly using US examples here because I personally know those best, we have a whole history of unintended consequences. We have, in the book, I tell the story of one community, but it was one of dozens and dozens and dozens that created a plan for basically a pedestrian boulevard in its downtown that ultimately resulted in the demolition of most of that downtown and replacement with an enclosed mall. And that had implications economically, culturally, socioeconomically, you name it. Huge impact. If you're familiar with the story of Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, a few weeks ago, I talked about the book Nobody by Mark Conter. And one of the extraordinary things in that book is that he takes multiple kind of top of mind stories about atrocities committed against Black individuals and daisy chains those back to planning, community development, economic development decisions that were made in many cases 20, 30, 40, 50 years earlier. So the situation, for example, that led to or created the context in which, a shooting of an unarmed Black individual happened can be traced back, sometimes over decades, to a situation that was created as a planning or economic development or community development response to a perceived ill of an earlier era. So, for example, in Mark Conter's book, he describes the community in Ferguson, Missouri, as being a direct consequence of the urban renewal of the 40s and 50s and the construction of Pruitt-Igoe, and the social ills that Pruitt-Igoe perpetuated. That was one of the first kind of big monolithic affordable housing developments in the United States. It was so bad that it ended up being demolished within about 20 years. But there's a consequence that flows through from what happened then to what happened in the future. And it's just like that periwinkle, but obviously in a case like that, much more insidious and much more damaging. And one of the things that if I had to do it over again a little bit, I might have lightened up on writing that book. I might have lightened up on the flower metaphors, because one of the risks of a metaphor is, again, that it never does exactly what you intended it to do, or it does that plus more. And so often the things that we have done to make cities better have created these kinds of unintended consequences. Now, like I said, that's heavy. And I know that when I was younger and I was looking at these issues and trying to grapple with that and really starting to see how people who had good intentions, people who had, the same degrees or letters or whatever that I had created, some of these challenges, or had created unintended consequences as a result of trying to solve something else. That was really the juncture point at which I started to say, I've got to figure out a very different way of doing this, because doing the thing and expecting the result and thinking that it's going to be this ipso facto relationship, like I said in that first principle, that becomes really problematic when you actually look at what happened. So often we do a thing, excuse me, we create a project, or we create an initiative, and it may do what we intended, but it may also do much more, for good or for ill. And a lot of the local economy revolution has arrived, talks about those issues, talks about kind of anticipating and dealing with those unintended consequences. And the very words unintended consequence feel hopeless. It feels like, oh my God, if it's unintended and it's a consequence, then it's out of my control. I can't do anything about it. And that's not true. As the book talks about, there are some very well documented, very clear, and very intelligent ways that we can approach the work of making our communities better, of taking care of the places that we care about, without running the risks associated with that ipso facto machine input, machine output kind of thinking. So if there's a lesson that I want people to really come away from the book with, it is probably that one. That to me is really one of the most important things that we can be talking about, is taking a more holistic, a more environmentally, ecologically, not just in terms of nature, but in terms of our roles within our full context, and making sure that we are anticipating to the greatest extent we can those unanticipated consequences. Like I said, that sounds undoable. It's actually very, very doable. And we talk about that a lot in this book. So as you go into this weekend, it might be interesting for you to take a look around, maybe at some of the big projects that have happened in your community over the past, let's call it things that happened 20 years ago. One that I use a lot is the construction of football stadiums or convention centers or neighborhood improvement projects. That might be a streetscape, that might be a new construction building, that might be something. But if you take a look at kind of what's transpired around them, and you really look at it with a critical eye, and by critical, I don't mean mean. By critical, I mean kind of open-minded and assessing. Chances are this whole question of unintended consequences will become much clearer. It'll be much easier for you to anticipate and to understand kind of that big question. And as I've said a few times in these broadcasts, the thing that makes the situation that we're in right now, as people living on the cusp between an industrial era and a future era that I sometimes call the fusion era. You may also hear fourth industrial revolution. I avoid that one because it gets a little confusing. But we're in this moment of transition, and figuring out how to work in that moment of transition requires two things. On the surface, it requires appropriate tools and techniques and methods and programs and all of that kind of thing. But at the deeper level, the more profound, the more fundamental level, we are all driven. We all work within the context of our paradigms, of our sort of unspoken assumptions about how things work, how things need to be done, how the world around us operates. And the great challenge that we have in this period now is that our paradigms, for almost all of us, we've come up in an industrial era paradigm that made certain assumptions. What we have to be able to do now is to transition not only our tools and our techniques, but our assumptions and our paradigm and our expectations and our world view to something that's very profoundly different. So that's why we're talking through these first principles. They're the means of putting that new thinking and that new paradigm in front of our faces so that we can see it and make it a little bit harder to just reflexively fall back into doing things the way we've done before. And being aware of that interconnectedness and that potential for unintended consequences is really a crucial element of both that transition and to how we need to respond, how we, in all of our roles and all of our capacities, need to be thinking about how we help our communities. So this is like a foundation layer. You know, you can consider this like the stones or the concrete blocks in the foundation of your local economy revolution in your place that you care about. We're on the way. We have all of the tools and the techniques and the availability. Sometimes the biggest thing blocking us from discovering and moving in the most effective direction is this gray stuff right up in here. So we have the opportunity to rethink and to create the paradigm and the tools and then methods and all the stuff in a whole new way. And to me, that's completely exciting. It's not easy, but it's completely exciting. So there's something to chew on in the shower or while you're walking the dog, or you know, if you're if you're in a place where you got to start mowing the lawn already, something to think about this weekend. Hopefully, most of you aren't having to shovel snow this weekend, but it'll work then too. So thanks again for taking the time. I really appreciate your listening, and I feel like I'm learning how to explain some of these very abstract concepts a little bit better every time I do one of these videos. And I'm going to stop now before my dry throat catches up with me. So thanks again. And like I always tell you, because I know you can, go get them. Thanks.